this as a person who spent a lifetime in conservation and a lifetime in international development, and look at where those areas come together. And the one thing we know about the last 3 years, as I kind of mentioned, is that they were super sucky, right? But sucky in a serious way. 600 million, this is from about a week ago, 600 million infections. Global deaths are 6 million, but we estimate just from essentially hidden deaths in the statistics, that was probably closer to 18 million. US infections were 15% of the earth, similarly with US deaths. But 65 to 75 million people, I used to be chief scientist at USAID, were pushed back into extreme poverty. 80 million more were malnourished. US life expectancy dropped because we didn't care about our elders in terms of 2.7 years. And we know that it is these places like wet markets in Wuhan that could be one of the places where we believe that this spillover event happened. And these types of events are not rare, right? They are now the exception, and they're now happening faster and faster with Marburg and Zika and dengue and all these others. What I'm arguing, and I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, is that we are selecting for rapid changes in pathogen biology through habitat fragmentation, through wildlife change, through climate shifts, through environmental pollution. We see this. This is a wet market in Sulawesi that I was at, where fruit bats were being killed and sold and slaughtered in the markets. We know that pangolins were featured or thought to be featured at the center of the COVID-19 pandemics. They are the most trafficked global wildlife trade species or group of species. There are about 5 species of pangolins that are out there. We just heard about monkeypox. And the original monkeypox outbreak was because of the pet trade, where we had this Gambian pouch rat placed next to prairie dogs. And where I worked in Madagascar, I lived in a tent for 3 years in Madagascar trying to understand why certain species of lemurs go extinct and others survive, is that we found that lemurs in fragmented habitats would get malaria because those habitats were then surrounded by rice paddies. We know in places like Connecticut, the loss of regulatory species, of our apex predators, have allowed new diseases like Rocky Mountain spotted fever or Lyme to spread. And we know that climate change suggests that here in Washington, D.C., we will start seeing dengue, better known as bone break fever. It's not one you really want to get. But what I find that's really interesting is the idea of reverse zoonotic events, that we can actually move from wildlife to domestic animals and humans back into wildlife where that new mutations can develop. And some of the most extraordinary numbers I remember seeing last fall was that 40% of the deer tested in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and New York were found to be infected with COVID-19. 80% of the deer in New York had the Omicron variant. And there's some belief that rats and deer had some role in the development of those. But I think that there's a larger framing, and this framing is really around our misuse of nature. That our demand for protein, cooling, plastics, fiber, and materials, the literal clothes we wear, the fashion industry itself could actually drive the spread of disease and undermine human health. We know that as billions of people move into middle class, they will not want 50% to 70% more food. They will be eating large amounts of protein. And that protein will drive the inputs we put into the water systems like nitrogen and phosphorus and pesticides. It will demand much greater amounts of energy. It will lead to deforestation. And in fact, it's estimated we need something like an area the size of the United States to be cleared to meet that demand for protein. That is, the US is 950 million hectares. That is the equivalent of losing the Amazon basin and the Congo basin. Even things like the EV transition is having, and our desire for electronics is having inadvertent effects. We work in the heart of the Amazon in a place called Madre de Dios in Peru. We set up an office there in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, to track this thing called artisanal scale mining. Artisanal scale mining sounds like something you would buy on Etsy, but it's not. It's actually unorganized, frequently illegal mining that is responsible for a significant part of the gold in the world and tantalum in the world that's used in our computers and our phones that are in your pockets. It is used, cobalt that's from the Congo that's used in the EV batteries that we have. Here in the Amazon, this is gold mining. This was, within 3 years of this picture being taken, 100 to 120 foot trees, jaguars and peccaries and all kinds of primates in this forest. It is now a landscape. 30,000 hectares were cleared by 15,000 miners in 3 years. And what is extraordinary is the water is now, the landscape is now 1/3 water that's contaminated by mercury. Artisanal scale gold mining is 40% of the world's mercury emissions because the mercury is used to amalgamate the gold. And that mercury has impacts on our immunity. It has impacts on global health. It is bioaccumulating in the fish that you ultimately eat. Microplastics are literally are another major source. And 35% of microplastics are microfibers. So even when you are wearing natural fibers, if you have stretch in those natural fibers, you're wearing oil and gas on your shirts. We know that with microplastics and microfibers, and particularly the shedding of those microfibers, that we now have them in our table salt, in our beer, in our tea, in 94% of US tap water, and now in our blood. We're also finding that those microfibers are essentially carriers for pollutants and for disease. It's precipitating microfibers in the Arctic and the Antarctic in the snow. So how do we fix this? And we've heard about some of the solutions. I just want to, there's a real badass in the center of this picture. You might have seen him just on stage. But thinking about targeted predictions based on landscape level features and modeling, thinking about international development and global health needs, thinking about weather stations that couple with that modeling so we can actually get the data that we need on the ground and the actionable insights that allow all of us in conservation and all of us in development to work together to find solutions that we need. For too long, we thought about conservation as an entirely different field than development. But global health, food security, and conservation actually need to work together within what we're doing. When I was here in 2019, I talked about this tool, which was useful for wildlife trafficking and fish traceability. As you may remember, 30% of the fish you eat is not what they say it is, and 86% of the time it comes from a less sustainable market. We realized in March 2020 that this would be a really useful tool for COVID. So we started thinking about, right, we have the accuracy of a PCR, but the ease of use, the cost, and the speed. We get a positive within 9 minutes on this device right now of a lateral flow test, your rapid test, right? And it's portable, and it's useful for any DNA, RNA, or protein. And we wanted to take this idea of taking biosurveillance out of the lab to the front lines, to the places where millions of TB cases are actually getting missed. So we wanted to create a tool that anyone, my 6-year-old son, could use to do a genetic ID. The bigger piece of this is we think that part of the problem is how diagnostics are actually developed. And we wanted to create the equivalent. We realized that we couldn't create a test for everything we wanted. We couldn't create a test for every variant that there needed to be. So we decided to come up with an analogy from the PlayStation. Could we create a software development kit equivalent for molecular science and unlock diagnostics that are in millions of labs, not millions, but lots of labs around the world, and be just like what happens with PlayStation? Sony makes 5% of the games. They don't make the blockbusters. But their device really depends on other people using something like an SDK, and we're looking at trying to do that within what we're trying to do. We also recognize there are other tools that conservationists can use. I used to work in Afghanistan tracking things like snow leopards. And I'd use a tool like this, which is a camera trap, which are dumb, passive devices. They all have one thing in common, and that is a memory card. And we said, can we actually plug into the memory card slot and add and make them smarter by adding essentially edge AI, so local artificial intelligence, machine vision, and machine learning. And what we realized we could do is start saying, can we actually find poachers when we want? Can we find people with guns? Can we find species of interest? Can we actually describe behaviors? And we also realized that we could start describing diseases. These are Florida panthers in Florida. They get a neurological disease, and you can pick it up from their phenotype, the way that they actually behave and they walk. This is a mother and her 3 cubs. You can see 2 of them are healthy, and you can see the 3rd is actually picked up by the AI. So we're working to take those individuals out of the population because the Florida panther is down to tens of animals. And we need to, this can't be an extinction event for what we're trying to do. And then looking at things like prion-based diseases, like chronic wasting disease that's spreading across. Prions are mad cow, right? So if we're thinking about potential risks, how do we actually set up the surveillance systems around what we have? But ultimately, it means a reframing of our economy and our places. How do we think about landscape immunity within what we're trying to do? How do we actually replace the least sustainable parts of our economy with food, feed, fiber, and materials and tools that we need? It requires whole new pathways for industrialization, new economies, new industries, and I think this is a huge opportunity. Thank you.